Now, it's important for us to remember that oral language differs very greatly from written language, that we write in one voice, sort of, and we speak in a different voice, and they don't always function in the same way. So let's talk about some of the ways that oral language is different from written language. First, oral language has a smaller variety of words. And this is mainly because we don't have dictionaries in our heads. So we use words that we are familiar with more frequently because we can't just pull up random words and find synonyms as easily and things like that. So we use a smaller variety of words when we are speaking because it's so spontaneous. When we're writing, we have more time to think about what we're saying. So we use a wider variety of words, whereas when we're talking, it's all very much off the cuff. So we use a smaller variety of words when we are speaking, also because it helps our audience to better understand us. In addition, oral language has words with fewer syllables. So we use more $2 words and less $5 and $10 words, for example. We use simpler language, A, to make sure that we are understood, and B, because again, we don't have these dictionaries in our heads, right? We can't find the 6-syllable word that is equal to the 2-syllable word that we're thinking of when we're just talking. So we use words that have fewer syllables in order to be more easily understood and to more clearly get our message across. Oral language also has shorter sentences because again, right, there's less attention span when it comes to oral language, when it comes to listening to someone speak versus reading what someone has written. And if you are listening to someone speak, and they have these really long, drawn-out, convoluted sentences, you can't easily go back and figure out where that sentence began. But if you were reading something that was written, and there's a long, convoluted sentence, you can very easily go back and figure out where that sentence began if you got lost somewhere along the way, right? But we don't have that ability when it comes to listening, when it comes to the oral language, when it comes to communication. And so we use shorter sentences when we are using oral language. Oral language also has many more self-reference words, such as I, me, and mine. Your English teachers have probably told you to avoid these words for the most part, to not refer to yourself as a writer. But in oral language, we use this language all the time because we are present in that moment. So we say that I think that you should do this, or this is my opinion, those sorts of things. Oral language also has fewer quantifying terms, meaning that we use less precise numerical words. So, for example, rather than saying that there are 5,249 people who get killed by sharks every year, right, or something like that, we just say that there are over 5,000, right? We make things simpler for the oral, for the listening setting. Because of this, oral language also uses more pseudo-quantifying terms, right? So instead of using specific numbers, because again, with numbers, it can get very confusing very quickly, and we don't always remember the specific details when we're listening. We use words like many, or few, or some, in order to pseudo-quantify, to sort of quantify things, right? So we use fewer numbers, and we also use words to describe numbers more frequently. Oral language also has more extreme and superlative words than written language does. So we use language such as none, all, every, always, never, right? You always do this, or you never do that. That sort of language. Because, again, oral language is much more relaxed, right? It's much more natural than written language is. And it's almost like in our brains when we write that you always do this, it's so much more definitive than when we say something like that. So we tend to use those types of words in oral language much more frequently. Oral language also, on the other end of that coin, has more qualifying statements. So we use clauses that say unless, or that begin with the word unless, or that begin with the word except, right? So we say, you never take out the trash except when I ask you to, right? So we use more of these qualifying statements because we use more of the extreme and superlative words, right? One kind of goes with the other, because when we're using the more extreme and superlative words, we feel the need to not be as harsh, so we qualify those statements. Oral language also has more repetition of words and syllables. Oral language also has more repetition of words and syllables, right? Because again, kind of going back to this idea of oral language being so fleeting, is that our audience isn't always going to catch things the first time round. Oftentimes, we have to repeat ourselves in order to be understood, because our audience can't go back and figure out what we said earlier, because they don't have our speech in front of them. They don't have a written version of the speech. When we're reading and we get lost somewhere in the middle of a paragraph, we can very easily jump back up to the beginning of that paragraph and reread it to make sure that we understand. But in oral language, we don't have that option. So as a speaker, you have to make sure that you are repeating yourself in the context of your speech so that your audience can easily go back and remember what you've talked about. That's why we have preview statements. That's why transitions are so important. That's why we have a review at the end of the speech, because it really helps to drill into the mind of your audience what you're talking about. Oral language also uses more contractions. Again, oral language is much more informal than written language is. So we use the words like don't instead of do not, and can't instead of cannot. And I feel like this is changing a little bit in the modern age, but in written language, we still use do not and cannot much more frequently than we do don't and can't. Or rather, we use don't and can't in oral language much more frequently than we say, I cannot go to the movies with you, right? Oral language also has more interjections. So we use words that have exclamation points at the end, like wow, or really? No, those sorts of things, right? Because we can express things in oral language much more reliably than we can in written language, especially when it's something surprising or something of that nature. So we use much more interjections in oral language versus written language. In fact, in written language, one of the only places that you'll see an interjection is if someone is speaking in dialogue in that written language. And finally, oral language uses more colloquial language. So these are your kind of non-standard words, your words that are perhaps slang terms or that are local to a specific area. For example, in Northern California, hella was a word that was a colloquial word to specifically Northern California. Now, it has spread quite a bit in recent years, but it used to be that people outside of Northern California didn't understand what we meant by the word hella, or didn't understand what that word meant, right? Or didn't understand why we were using that word. But now, because of the internet age, it's much more easy to understand people when they use this sort of colloquial language. But again, you don't see this type of language in written language as much. It's only really in oral language that we hear these colloquial terms. So those are just some of the differences that exist between oral and written language. Overall, we see that oral is much more informal than written language, and again, that's mostly because of the off-the-cuff nature of oral language. Because we're thinking of things on the spot, we can't think as deeply as we do when we write, and we also just want to make sure that we are easily understood by our audience.